Architectural Artcast.
Like so many, I was sitting, watching, with my mouth hanging open as President Trump signed executive order after executive order, all while bantering with the press. All I could think was, wow, this is something. I have never seen anything like this in my entire life. Amongst all the other things going on, President Trump signed a presidential action promoting beautiful federal civic architecture. When you get past the flowery legal language, the gist of it is the appropriate people have 60 days to get back to the president with architectural recommendations for all new federal government buildings going forward. These new guidelines are required to ensure that federal public buildings should be visibly identifiable as civic buildings and respect regional, traditional, and classical architectural heritage in order to uplift and beautify public spaces and ennoble the United States and our system of self-government. Yeah, Randy. Trump is just politicizing architecture. Let me give you all a piece of advice. Better to be silent and thought a fool than open your mouth and remove all doubt. Architecture is political. It has always been political, and it will always be political. Reasons for this are legion, but two of the main reasons. The first main reason, architecture is expensive. It costs money, sometimes a lot of money. If an architect wants to practice their art, they have to find people who have money. And that oftentimes means they're dealing with governments. Every single aspect of a government project is political. Deciding to build the project in the first place. Who's going to get to design it? What's the design going to be? Who gets to build it? Who gets to use the building? Who has access to that building? Every single one of those is a political decision. The second main reason, architecture communicates. And we, as the architects, the clients, the culture at large, we communicate what we value by what we build. Governments want to hire architects who are willing to design architecture that will communicate the messages that the government wants the architecture to communicate. If an architect wants to be successful, particularly if they want to design a lot of government buildings, they have to become politicians, so that they know what the politicians want their buildings to communicate, and then they provide it. So architecture has always been political, and it will always be political. Setting aside my own personal biases as an architect type, I think that this presidential action has the potential to be one of the more profound things that President Trump did during that marathon signing session. The ideas expressed in this presidential order aren't being pulled out of somebody's butt. I've been advocating for these exact same ideas. The return of the celebration of beauty in architecture, the return of the celebration of beauty in general on this channel since its beginning. I might be an architect type, but I'm not conceited enough to think that people in positions of power are paying any attention to me yammering away on a little old channel with less than 800 subscribers. Speaking of which, if you enjoy hearing about beauty in the context of art, architecture, culture at large, subscribe. You'll get a lot more of me and my big mouth. Y'all see, I'm not the only one that's been calling for this. Prior to the late 40s, early 50s, the quest for beauty was architecture's raison d'etre, reason to exist. Last 70 years, architecture, society at large, has lost their way. It looks like there are people in positions of power who want to return to the quest for beauty. Yeah, Randy, you're just blowing smoke. We still have to wait 60 days for those people to get back to the president. We don't know what they're going to advise. This is all just speculative BS. Well, tell them, animal, about that. I'm willing to bet you we know exactly where the Trump administration is going. Did you know that they talked about this exact thing during their first administration? Did you know they issued an executive order on this very thing? Yeah, me neither. Back in December of 2020, there was quite a bit going on at that time. No wonder this slid under everybody's radar. But back in December of 2020, President Trump issued an executive order promoting beautiful federal civic architecture. This was one of President Trump's executive orders that President Biden, or whoever, immediately rescinded. Makes sense why it slid under everybody's radar. It just wasn't around that long. Besides having the same title as the new presidential order, it uses the same language to promote the same goals. I wouldn't be surprised if the person who wrote the presidential action isn't the same person who wrote the executive order. Both documents use identical language to make the same argument. The only difference, the earlier executive order lays out the argument in much more detail. Instead of going through the executive order piecemeal, trying to explain each separate part, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to present the underlying theory that the argument is built upon. Welcome to Architectural Outcast Introduction to Architecture 104, History and Theory of American Architecture. I recommend you take notes because it will be on the test, and no, I don't give extra credit. The first thing I have to address, the assumption underlying this argument is the exact same assumption that drove the history of art and architecture throughout the world. There is an objective standard to beauty. Yeah, there are subjective elements, but the foundation is an objective standard. And that objective standard is based upon mathematics, specifically the golden ratio. And before you say, yeah, that's just a Western-centric perspective, nope. You will find the golden ratio all over the world, all throughout time, and in all sorts of cultures. It appears over and over and over again, almost like it's some sort of universal principle. We have to begin with Greece. Yes, Greece had its antecedents as well. All starting points are arbitrary, so I'm arbitrarily starting this little story with Greece. The Greeks are famous for their mathematics. It's from them we get our modern understandings of scale and proportion. The Greeks' biggest contribution to architecture, once you get past scale and proportion, is the column. Not only did they give us the orders, they gave us the rules. When, how, and where you should use the different columns. The Greeks also gave us another very important concept, entasis, the idea of optical illusions. The Greeks figured out that if you have two lines close together, the longer those lines are, say like in a column, it will start to look like the two lines are bowing in towards each other. It's not really happening, it's an optical illusion. It has to do with the way the eye works, the curvature of the lens, light refraction, all that good stuff. They understood if you wanted everything to look straight and squared, you would have to curve all the lines outward slightly. There was a recognition if you wanted to achieve objective beauty, you had to take into account subjective perception. And everywhere you look in Greek architecture, you find the golden ratio. I'm going to be harping on this throughout this entire discussion because this becomes very important later on. The Greeks advocated that their civic buildings, government buildings, temples, what have you, should stand out. It should have presence and gravitas. There is a reason why the local pub looks very different than the courthouse, or it should. The civic building should tell the observer that something important goes on within that space, and it communicates how you are expected to act when you enter that space. When Rome appeared on the scene, they went for Greek architecture in a big way. Yes, they had other influences like the Etruscans, but they went for Greek architecture in a big way. If the Greeks were mathematicians, the Romans were engineers, megalomania engineers. They looked at what the Greeks had built and said, "That is cool. We can make it bigger and badder." The Romans further refined the columns, their orders, and when and how to use them. They contributed new building types like the basilica. They added building techniques like concrete, and they added the dome. The Romans took the idea that civic buildings should have presence and gravitas, and as the megalomaniacs they were, they cranked it up to 11. They now wanted you to be in awe of their civic buildings. After Rome fell in the West, and after craftsmen relearned building techniques like masonry, architectural styles built out of Greek and Roman traditions continued to evolve. There was the Romanesque, defined by thick, sturdy walls and the round arch. And then there was Gothic, defined by thin, high walls, large windows, and the pointed arch. The medieval world took the Roman idea that civic architecture should inspire awe and added to it inspiration. Civic architecture should want to make you look up, think about things greater than yourself. Meanwhile, back in Italy, the Renaissance was kicking off. People were rediscovering the power of Greek and Roman architecture by studying what remained of Greek and Roman architecture. Architects like Alberti were busy developing perspective. Brunelleschi was building the Duomo in Florence. Michelangelo was designing the Rome that we see today. And Palladio was putting his stamp all over Venice. Beyond all the art and architecture that was created during the Renaissance, the important thing was the attitude that they had towards art. Art and architecture was seen to be the highest of the arts, but it was believed that art ennobled the human spirit. It made us better people. This inspiration was seen to be so important to society that if a city got a new piece of art, they shut everything down and had a big celebration. If the art was something like a painting, a sculpture, they would parade it through the entire town, allowing everybody to see it. If it was a new building, they would open it up, allowing the entire city to come in, experience that space. The city would then throw a party that might last for days. This put a lot of pressure on the artist or architect because if the people of the city didn't like what they'd done, they just might decide to run the artist-architect out of town on the rail, preferably tarred and feathered. Everybody's a critic. The Renaissance spread across Europe like ripples, but sometimes it might take a generation or two before it moved on to the next area. England was the last place the Renaissance reached. In 1666, a great fire destroyed the heart of London. The architect who had the largest impact on the rebuilding of London was Christopher Wren. Wren is the one who is credited with bringing Renaissance architecture to England and popularizing it. In the context of influences on American architecture, of all the names I'm throwing out today, if there's one name you should remember, it's Christopher Wren. He has had one of the largest impacts on the foundation of American architecture. Just one example, the quintessential small-town American church. You know, the ones that appeared in all the old westerns, that were in the Frank Capra movies, that you find on postcards today? Those wouldn't exist without Christopher Wren. The image on the right is a little church designed by Christopher Wren. And the image on the left, a random church in New England. At the time when the American colonists started to get rowdy, get pissy with Parliament, and the Revolution kicked off, the height of architectural style in England was Georgian. Two classic examples of architects working in the Georgian style are Robert Adams and John Soane. Adams is on the left, Soane is on the right. Georgian architecture is an expression of British restraint. The architecture is pared back, simplified. The architecture goes back to the roots of classicism, simple, stark, and elegant. The way the wealthy showed off their status was with the use of fancy schmancy materials. After the American colonists sent those no-good redcoats packing, just kidding. Well, seeing as how my great-great-whatever uncle was Nathan Hale, maybe I ain't kidding. Those no-good redcoats. Anyhow, after the Revolution, the Founding Fathers, led by Washington and Jefferson, wanted to create an architecture that represented the ideals of this country. They wanted an architecture that would be distinct to America. They wanted an architecture that would make the American people proud. They didn't want an architecture that just made people proud to be Americans. They wanted an architecture that made the people proud of their social institutions, feel like that they were a part of those social institutions. They wanted an architecture that ennobled the people. Seeing as how the country was modeled on ancient Greece and the Roman Republic, they embraced Greek and Roman architecture. Washington, D.C., that city that was supposed to be the shining light on the hill, it was designed as a classical city. Again, it was supposed to reinforce the idea that America was different. It was a democratic republic where the government responded to the will of the people. Again, we also see the continuation of the idea that civic buildings should be special with weight and gravitas, that they communicate that what goes on in these spaces is special, important, and even sacred. They went further. In an attempt to create a uniquely American architecture, the Founding Fathers took Georgian architecture, they stripped it of its opulent materials and replaced them with American materials, and they further simplified all the architectural details. The Founding Fathers' efforts paid off. It worked in two very important ways. First, Americans liked this new architecture, simplified with classical references that became known as Federalist architecture. In small towns all across America, federal buildings, courthouses, post offices, what have you, became the pride of the community. If y'all are interested, I highly recommend the two-book series, Lost America. The original is way out of print, but Dover came out with a reprint a couple years ago. It's also out of print as well, but it can be found relatively cheap. Lost America documents all these old buildings, courthouses, post offices, commercial buildings, and private buildings from the 19th, early 20th century that have been torn down or lost in various other ways. The second way it worked, the Founding Fathers were successful in creating a unique American style by hitting the reset button on architecture. As Europe was going into the Baroque and beyond, America was going back to basics, which allowed them to take off in a completely different direction. Coming out of neoclassical and Federalist architecture, you had the development of Greek revival. American architecture became like a tree, sprouting branches going off in all sorts of new directions, like Beaux-Arts. And we can't forget my favorite, Art Deco. America is not monolithic, and it has always had its regional variations on architecture. There's Spanish colonial architecture, where Spanish settlers brought their traditional Spanish designs that were influenced by Renaissance and Moorish architecture, and they blended it with what they found in the areas they settled. There's Pueblo revival, taking traditional Pueblo architecture and then updating it with modern building materials and modern amenities. Here in Texas, you will find a regional style that sometimes is called Texas Art Deco, Centennial Art Deco, or Fairgrounds Art Deco. It is a blending of Art Deco with Spanish colonial and Pueblo revival. America is not monolithic. There is a tableau of unique styles in each region all across America. America had benefited from hitting the architectural reset button. America had developed its own architectural style. Every region was different. The only constant were the references to classical sources and a tendency for simplicity. Everything changed in 1962 when Daniel Moynihan, who later became senator from New York, wrote a memo that has since become gospel within the federal government. He insisted, we can't develop a national style. We got to keep politics out of architecture. We should allow the architects to tell the government what we should build. Sounds good, right? We'll just keep politics out of architecture. We'll allow the architects to tell us what needs to be built, and we in the government will just build what we're told. The problem? It's a lie. It's 100% bullshit. Architecture is political. It has always been political, and it will always be political, especially when you're building for the government. There are three specific problems with this particular lie. The first one, if their goal is really not to create an architectural style, they're 200 years too late. The real goal is to destroy the existing style. The second issue, Who decides what architect gets the job? That is always an ideological and political decision. Architecture communicates, and governments always hire architects that design buildings that communicate what the government wants them to communicate. Architects who work for governments consistently are ideological, are political. Third problem. Okay, so they don't want to impose an architectural style on the country. Well then, why do they always pick the exact same style for the new buildings? Well, the name of that style will give the game away. International style. Get rid of the past. Kill it if you have to. It all goes back to the golden ratio. See, I told you all this would be coming back, and it's important. The human body's proportions are based upon the golden ratio. If you design your building around the golden ratio, it's built upon the same proportions as the human body, just on a bigger scale. Remember the goal of the founding fathers. They wanted the American people to have a connection to their civic architecture, to like it and appreciate it and value it. The Greeks, the Romans, all the way through to our founding fathers here in America, they created a human-centric architecture. Buildings that have spaces that have been built around human proportions, granted on a larger scale, sometimes much larger scale, we intuitively understand those spaces. We intuitively like those spaces. That makes us value and like the building, which means we become more receptive to the symbolism, the messaging of the building. The American people have never liked the use of modernism in federal civic buildings. They're not stupid. They understand these buildings aren't human-oriented. In fact, they're openly hostile to the American people. Instead of celebrating the American experiment, seeking to evoke pride, the international style denies the existence of the individual. It wants us to believe we're nothing more than a cog in the monolithic collective. Every single space is unique and affects human behavior. Space tells us how we're supposed to act within that space. The courtroom on the left is a special sacred space where important things happen, important decisions are made. It's where every single individual who comes into that space, whether they be the judge, the jury, the lawyers, or the defendant, are important. It means that they have to weigh every single decision because these decisions matter to individuals. The courtroom on the right is a mundane, unpleasant space that barely meets the qualifications of habitation. The decisions that happen in this courtroom are irrelevant. Guilty, next, guilty, next. And the people that are in this courtroom, all the way around, they're irrelevant as well. They're just cogs in the machine to be used until they're worn out and thrown away. I repeat, the American people aren't stupid. They got the message that these modernist federal buildings were sending. And by the mid-90s, the outcry was so loud that the federal government said, okay, we hear you. We'll change things. And they did. They made sure the American people had absolutely no say in the design of federal buildings. We're supposed to have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And the American people have very consistently said they want their federal civic buildings to be of a very specific architectural style, American style. And this government of the people, by the people, and for the people have consistently said, piss off, we'll put the designs we want. These days, the federal government is hiring architects from New York City to design civic buildings for Salt Lake City. They're trying to destroy regional architectural traditions, make everything homogeneous, the same, cogs in the machine, get rid of the past, kill it if you have to. Randy, you're not being very objective in this analysis. What part of advocating this for years did you miss? During research for this video, I saw articles from around the time the original executive order came out from all the usual suspects, media, academia, some architects, and they were doing the usual freak out. You're politicizing architecture. You're making architecture ideological. You're denying us our creativity. You're a bad person. Insert typical insults here. If you're going to take the presidential candidate's head, you better take the presidential candidate's head. And you better be darn sure he's not going to get elected. President Trump and this team, they don't care about screeching and name calling anymore. And President Trump or somebody on this team understands the cultural importance of architecture. Architecture is political. It's always been political, and it will always be political. One side has recognized that, and they took control of federal civic architecture and imposed their ideology. That's why the usual suspects screeched so loud when that original order came out, and that's why the Biden regime made that order disappear lickety-split. They understood the long-term consequences of that order. Amongst all the other stuff going on, pay close attention to that presidential action. Keep an eye. See what happens. Because, like I said at the beginning, this has the potential to have the biggest long-term impact of everything the Trump administration does. At any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about, and until next time, y'all be safe. If y'all are still here, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. While you're at it, why don't you like this video, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell. You can hear me yammer on about something else next time. And feel free to share this video far and wide.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.